In this video I'm going to be concentrating on the character of Macduff, and I'm going to be analysing him in relation to a very specific character archetype, that of the Nemesis figure. And I just want to set at the beginning a really clear definition of nemesis. It's a word that in general conversation is often used just to mean enemy, and that's not necessarily inaccurate, but the actual meaning of the word is a little more precise than that. It goes back to ancient Greece. Macbeth, as we know, is a tragedy, and tragedies were invented in ancient Greek theatres. So a lot of the conventions of the tragic genre have their roots in the values of ancient Greek society. One of those values was moderation. The idea that any aspect of a character or personality could cause harm if it were present in too great a quantity. This was a very important idea in ancient Greece, and on the temple of Apollo at Delphi was inscribed the words "nothing in excess." In other words, everything should be present in moderation. There shouldn't be too much of anything. Now, tragedies typically concern themselves with social disorder, threats to the proper running of society. And what you see in a lot of these plots is that the tragic hero oversteps the boundaries of what's socially acceptable. They transgress. And as a result of that transgression, there is a pushback. Order is restored at the end of the play thanks to an equal and opposite force that's pushing back against their transgression. And it's this pushback, that equal and opposite force that brings society back into order, that forms the nemesis. It's worth briefly looking at the etymology of the word. It comes from the idea of allotting a due portion, providing just punishment. It's related to the Greek word nomos, which means law. And in some texts, like Macbeth, it is personified in a single character, and that's what brings us to Macduff. So to just define nemesis as meaning enemy is a bit of a limited way to look at the idea. It's certainly true that Macduff is the enemy of Macbeth, but the concept goes deeper than that. Macduff is not just Macbeth's enemy. Macduff is the figure that restores order to Scotland at the end of the play. But before we can really analyse Macduff, we have to analyse Macbeth first as being a transgressor. We have to look at the way Macbeth violates social boundaries. This is where historical context comes into play. Specifically, the concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that the monarch on the throne of a country was ordained by God. It was God's will that a particular individual would sit on the throne as king or queen. That means when Macbeth murders Duncan, it is not just a case of murder, which is transgressive in its own right. It is an act of blasphemy. Macbeth is going against the order of things that God has decided. Duncan, for his part, is said to be an extremely good man, as befits a character who is chosen for his role by God. That quotation there that I've got highlighted about him being so clear in his great office is spoken by Macbeth early on in the play as he tries to avoid having to murder him. Indeed, it is the fact that he is so good that provides us with evidence that he has been chosen by God, or at least that is how a Jacobean audience would have regarded the character. Now we can contrast that with how Macbeth comes across once he is king. We're told in Act 4 that Scotland is materially suffering as a result of his being king. The land itself is suffering, and that suffering of the country has come to symbolise the inappropriateness of the role of Macbeth. It is not just that he is a murderer, it is not just that he is a bad king, he is occupying a role in society that was never meant for him. In that regard, he is a double transgressor. He is a murderer, but he is also a usurper. He has taken on a social role not intended for him, and that has a knock-on effect on the entire country of Scotland, which suffers as a consequence. So this provides us with the social disorder, and this is where we need a Nemesis figure to come in and push back and restore order. This brings us to Macduff. Macduff has his first real input in Act 2, Scene 3, which is the scene where Duncan's body is discovered. Indeed, it's Macduff who first raises the alarm. It's significant, I think, that this is his first real action, because it establishes him as a figure in the play who is going to represent law and order, and who is going to work to discover the murderer and work to restore the order that has been disrupted by the murder of the king. I think it's quite telling that he has no role earlier in the play. It is almost as if Scotland has conjured him up at this specific moment in order that he might defend it against this usurping figure who's murdered its rightful king. A large part of Act 3 is taken up by the conclusion of Banquo's story. But as soon as we get to the beginning of Act 4, the central role that Macduff is going to play in concluding this tragedy is established by the witches. Macbeth receives the supernatural instruction to beware Macduff. In fact, that's the only prophecy of all that he receives that is an imperative instruction. It's the only one that isn't a straightforward statement. So if we had any lingering doubts about whether Macduff was more significant or more important than other characters, that's put them to rest. A good chunk of Acts 4 and 5 is building towards the final confrontation between Macbeth and Macduff. Now this all leads to the final battle, a fair fight between Macduff and Macbeth, in which we discover that Macduff indeed does have a central role in the prophecy that governs Macbeth's fate. Now, Macbeth has many enemies, and it's important not to look at Macduff as just another one of his enemies and the one that got lucky. What makes him the Nemesis figure to Macbeth is how he represents a restoration of social order, and he does this by hailing Malcolm as the rightful king immediately after killing Macbeth. It is the first thing he says after Macbeth is dead. Hail, king, for so thou art. He never expresses the desire for power in his own right. He represents exactly the kind of moderation that would have been regarded as virtuous by the ancient Greeks who first established the conventions of the tragic genre. Just to highlight the point, while the murder of his family might provide him with an emotional reason to want to take revenge on Macbeth and allot him his due punishment, that's not the reason he's leading an army against him. He had already gone to England to find Malcolm and raise an army before Macbeth ever decided to kill him and his family. So there are political and principled reasons for his wanting to fight back against Macbeth that existed before any personal reason. So just to wrap this up, my main point really is that you shouldn't regard Macduff as just a soldier who got lucky. Just another one of Macbeth's enemies who happened to be better in a fight. Macduff is Macbeth's nemesis. That means it is his role to restore order to Scotland that has been disrupted by Macbeth's usurping the throne. As such, Macduff has the weight and the force of destiny behind him, and that is what allows him to do what no other character was able to do and defeat Macbeth. So, if you're analysing him, it's important to think of him not just as being another character, but as occupying a particular role within the narrative that can only be explained by the historical context, that includes the divine right of kings, and the genre context, the ancient Greek conventions of tragedy, which give us the idea of the Nemesis.